Hi, fourth graders. Welcome to your Wednesday, week 25, day 3, reading warm-up corrections. If you have not yet done week 25, day 3, please pause the video now, do the assignment, and then check back in with this to correct it. So let's get started. So far on day 1 and 2, what you guys have read about is that back in the 1800s, the world was changing pretty quickly. New inventions and technologies were coming out, things like electricity and automobiles, things we take advantage of today, but were new to people back then. And as is often the case with a lot of new technologies and inventions, some of these things came with a lot of people's fears and apprehensions, mostly in just not knowing how these things worked. They just needed to become educated about them to understand that they were a useful technology. So at first, there was a lot of fear and apprehension about how quickly the world was changing and if all this technology was a good thing or not. So I'm going to scroll down here to day 3, where I'm going to correct with you guys today. And I'll start by reading the passage first, and then we'll answer the questions. Today, we get to be introduced to an author, a classic author. She's written a very famous book many of you guys will at least know the character of. And this author was inspired to write this story based on just what was going on around her in those times, kind of playing off of people's worries and fears about how the world was changing. So let's get started. I'll begin reading the passage first. You can follow along. In the early 1800s, life was changing very fast. Many people moved from farms to cities. People started to work in factories. Many people didn't like the big changes. They saw that there was a lot of sickness, pollution, and poverty. Poverty means people with no money, poor. They thought life was becoming too dangerous and stressful. These people thought that humans had gone too far with technology. They were afraid of what would happen if there were any more machines. One woman wrote a book about this. Her name was Mary Shelley. Her book was called Frankenstein. The book is about a man who makes a new creature, but when he sees what he has done, he realizes that he has gone too far. The book became very popular. It is sometimes called the first science fiction novel. All right, so with that reading of the passage done, let's look at our couple questions for today. The first question says, which literary genre is Frankenstein? So we have to think about what kind of book, what type of writing is happening in it. A nonfiction book would be an informational book. Is Frankenstein a real life creature that from the past? No. So this is not a nonfiction, real facts story. Science fiction. So yeah, it's a made up story, so the fiction part makes sense. Science fiction are stories that are made up that have scientific elements in it, things like futuristic inventions, possibly space travel, stuff like that. So science fiction seems like a pretty good fit for this story, since this inventor was able to build this person and bring him to life. So I'm liking science fiction. I'm going to keep that in mind here. Realistic fiction would be, again, like we've talked about, stories that could take place in real life, even though this story is made up. So a story like Wonder is a great example of a realistic fiction. It's a story about a boy who is dealing with real life problems that could truly happen. So realistic fiction, I don't think, is probably the best fit for Frankenstein, because as far as we know, we're not inventing or bringing things back to life that have been dead. And a fairy tale, again, is more like your stories of Hansel and Gretel and The Little Mermaid and some of those classic old fairy tale stories. So I'd say the best fit is definitely science fiction. Let's see if I can select my highlighter here. Bear with me and the other teachers as we learn how to do this well. Science fiction. There we go. Yeah, Frankenstein's a science fiction novel. Let's move down to number 2. How did many people feel about the changes of the 1800s? When I read that question, I'm wondering, am I supposed to infer that and just figure it out based on what I read, or should I go back and see if the text has any clues? I think I'm going to go back and check in the text, but I do feel like I have a decent idea about which is the right answer. When I look at my choices, are people feeling happy about the changes in the 1800s? I don't know. I didn't get that from that story. Excited about the changes. I think maybe some were excited, but that's not what the passage really got at. I remember it saying something about people were worried about it. So bored doesn't seem to fit. I think I like afraid. I'm going to go back in the text and just double check, see if I can find anything that really points that out as being true. In the early 1800s, life was changing very fast. Many people moved from farms to cities. They didn't like to work in factories. They didn't like the big changes. Let me see. They saw sickness, pollution, and poverty. They thought life was becoming too dangerous and stressful. These people thought humans had gone too far with technology. They were afraid. There we go. They were afraid of what would happen if there were any more machines. I think that that is the text evidence we needed. These people, whoops, here we go. They were afraid of what would happen if there were any more machines. That is what we were looking for. Yep, they were feeling afraid. Let's go down and mark afraid. Okay, number 3. How many syllables are in the word Frankenstein? I love counting my syllables out. I also use my syllables to help me figure out how to spell big, challenging words, break it into its chunks of sound, and spell out those pieces. So let's see if we can clap out Frankenstein. 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 I'm counting 3. Frankenstein. 3 syllables, 3 chunks of sound. Frankenstein. Okay. Number 4, a novel is a kind of recipe? No, that's for cooking in the kitchen. A novel is a kind of a book, a machine, or a person. A novel is a kind of a book. And to be more specific, a novel is a narrative fiction story that is lengthy. So we're not thinking about these really short stories. We're thinking about those chapter books, fiction narrative stories. That's a novel. And number 5, comparing technology to a monster is an example of what type of figurative language? Is it imagery, a metaphor, alliteration, or onomatopoeia? So again, I still struggle with my figurative language, remembering which is which. I looked this one up to help me out, and a metaphor is the one we're looking for. Metaphors compare one thing to another. And a metaphor is different from a simile. Similes also compare one thing to another, but similes use the words like or as. So you could say, I am as fast as a cheetah. I'm comparing myself to a cheetah with the word as. A metaphor is comparing 2 things, usually something living to something non-living, or giving a non-living quality to something living. So an example or 2 could be things like saying that my brother is boiling mad. Boiling mad, boiling like hot water. He's not really boiling, but it helps us understand that he's stewing. He's real mad, right? Another example is to say something like, her face was shining brightly, right? To signify that she's happy, right? A happy, shiny face, right? But it's not actually shining like a light, right? So adding that symbolism there to help us kind of get an idea. So that's a metaphor. Comparing 2 things, not using the words like or as. Okay, 4th graders, well, that's all for today's day 3 of week 25 reading warm-up corrections. So keep practicing. I hope you guys are continuing to do your best to learn at home. Do check in online. We're trying to continue to connect with you guys there, and just make the most of things as you can, you guys. We're missing you. Take care. If I can figure out how to turn it off. There we go. Bye, you guys.